to speak on the themes of a book I recently wrote and published. And I was hoping, I wanted to be able to share at least some of those voices when my book came out. My book, which I'll mention now and at the end, is Sanctuary, Being Christian in the Wake of Trump. And it's available on Amazon, but I prefer to share with people about bookshop.org, which I had never heard about until a member of my church told me about it. And bookshop.org, any book that you buy there, it comes to you as fast as with Amazon. It's slightly less expensive, and they give a percentage of what you pay them to support independent bookstores. And you can choose an independent bookstore near you or any one that you like. And if you don't name one, they'll look for your zip code and pick whatever's closest to you. But since January, they've raised over $1 million for independent bookstores. So I think it's wonderful. And I love telling people about it. You know, regardless of if you order my book, order any books you might want to order. I really check out bookshop.org. So this is the second week of doing this sanctuary, Living Sanctuary series. And last week we heard from Wendy Kaplan, who's the director of Trinity Place Shelter here at the church for homeless LGBTQIA young adults. And we also heard last week from Ross Murray, who's the Senior Director of Education and Training at the GLAAD Media Institute, which provides training and education in media for queer and allied community members. And that conversation is also up on our YouTube channel. Tonight, I am thrilled to have two really powerful voices speaking to immigration issues. The first speaker is Sadie Bravo. She is a DACA recipient and dreamer. I've known her since she came here when she was about 3 years old. She is now an amazing adult. She's been organizing for over 10 years very courageously. And she has also taken the initiative to bring these kinds of conversations into the corporate world under diversity and inclusion initiatives. And she's also been really instrumental in communicating the importance of Latinos working with Black Lives Matter. And you'll see she's rocking a Black Lives Matter t-shirt tonight. The second person we have speaking is Christopher Vergara, who's the chair of the Advocacy Task Force of the Metropolitan New York Synod of the ELCA, Lutheran Church. And he has helped with organizing our national ELC effort and our local Metro New York effort to be a sanctuary church. And his primary area of work and interest has been with migrant minors. And I also want to offer him wonderful congratulations. Tonight, earlier at the Seafarers International House Right of Asylum Advocacy event, Christopher was most deservedly awarded the 2020 Friends of Immigrant Award. So it's a big night for Christopher, and we're so grateful that he could be here with us for this part of the evening. So without me speaking anymore, because the point is to hear from others predominantly, I will turn it over first to Sarai.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you to Pastor Heidi for inviting us tonight and giving us the opportunity to speak about immigration. As Heidi mentioned, my name is Sadie Bravo. I actually came to New York at the age of 4. My dad was actually already living here in New York City. And then my mom and I came to visit. We have been living in New York for the past 20 years, more than that at this point. And so I consider New York my home, but I kind of stumbled upon immigration, and my journey started in high school in my senior year. So, you know, my parents really brought me up with the idea of education being really the forefront of getting ahead of life and sort of the American dream. And so from early age, I really focused on school, getting the right grades. And so in high school, when it was time to start applying for colleges, I sort of came into my appointment with my guidance counselor with, you know, my list of colleges, what I was thinking of going. My main dream was to really just get away and have that American college experience. And after meeting with my counselor, she said, okay, well, do you have Social Security? Let's figure out how you're going to pay for college. And I was like, well, yep, let me go to my parents and get that. And that's how I sort of understood and came to the conclusion of what it meant to be undocumented. So it was really a big shot. And I was actually very lucky enough to be working with Pastor Heidi, and at that time, one of our interns, Haley Bay, who really helped me sort of figure out different pathways so I can continue my education in college. I ended up being able to have in-state tuition at that point, which I was very lucky to. At a CUNY, I went to Brooklyn College, but it was sort of at that point where I was just in shock and couldn't believe that there was nothing and no kind of pathway available for people like me to continue their education. So it was at that point where a friend of mine who also went to school with me introduced me to the world of dreamers and immigration rights. And so I sort of had to learn very early on that no one was going to be advocating on my behalf. And so I had to take it upon myself to really teach my counselor and everyone else around me, my parents and people younger than me who were about to be in the same situation that I was, how to navigate this new space. And so earlier on in that stage, I began volunteering with different immigration groups, specifically led by young people at that point. Dreamers, as we called ourselves, and that's the name that we go by, was still something very new. We began taking actions, going to DC, speaking with senators, telling them our stories and really pushing for the DREAM Act. But at that point, it was really to help us have a path to citizenship where we would be able to go to college, be able to work here, provide back to the economy, and essentially have citizenship to this country. That has been in progress for many, many years now. At this point, we still do not have something in place like that where we have a definitive pathway to citizenship, but we do have what we have, program, what we called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was something that came up during the Obama era in 2012, which essentially provides people like me who came to this country as children the opportunity to renew their work permit for 2 years, which unfortunately earlier this year under Trump was pushed back to 1 year. But at least it allows us the ability to continue our education and work for this country and support our families. I've been working throughout my entire years, not only with immigration, but also sort of taking and navigating that conversation in the workplace. So I've been working within the marketing and advertising industry, and diversity and inclusion has been something that it has been really huge, specifically within that specific space. And so one of the things that I've been working on in the last couple of years is how can we get more diversity, but also more DACA recipients and immigrants into the door, specifically into these corporate jobs. And then most recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, that was something that is very dear to my heart. I began reaching out to different organizers, and there is an organization called, sorry, I forgot the name of it, but an organization led by young advocates who are teenagers. And so we sort of started a conversation over Instagram about the importance of having Latinos support the Black Lives Matter. So one of the things that we started talking about was why weren't Latinos being an active voice within this conversation? And so we decided to host multiple different meetings and talking about why Latinos really have a voice within this space and how we can really be allies. And so for us, really within the space right now, it's really to come together, Black and Brown communities, because we know and we understand that this is an issue that affects both of us. But also because there are so many deep rooted conflicts within the Latino community, which when Black Lives Matter protests really started coming into light. And so it was a very hard conversation to navigate, specifically within our Latino community, because there is a lot of racism, a lot of colorism, and although it is hard conversations to have, it needs to happen in order for us to come together. Because as everyone knows how the current political climate is, together is going to be the only way we can have a stronger voice. And so we started to have more of a series of these conversations of what does colorism look like within the Latino community? How can you begin tackling these conversations with your family members? There's so many things that are wrong within the Latino community that we have to call out in order for us to move forward. which is sort of the toolkit that we have tried to build together and share with the rest of the community, not only within your families, but also at work. How can you start calling these things out? In terms of going back into having these conversations with Black Lives Matter, but also how this sort of comes together with immigration, it's also another light in terms of the immigration community doesn't really spotlight a lot of these issues within Black immigration. And so this is another big issue for me that I want to bring to light. Why are we not talking about immigrants and our Black immigrants and how we can be, supporting them and giving them the spotlight? So that is another reason why there's so much intersectionality between both immigration and Black Lives Matter. Apart from that, I've also worked with a number of organizations that are also now continuing to have these conversations and working cross collaboratively with different Black Lives Matter organizations, including Cosecha, Harvest, and most recently Raíces, which is an organization that's based out of Texas. And so with them, we've actually done a lot of work now more recently with Black Lives Matter, having more of these open conversations and sort of giving the floor to different Black Lives Matter activists, which is what is needed right now. But we've also done a lot of work with childhood minors and work that we've done in terms of putting installations all over the country. In New York, if you've seen them earlier last year, this summer, we actually installed multiple different cages. One of the most iconic ones that I remember because it was right outside of my office was in front of the New York Times building, where we put cages to symbolize children, migrant children that were locked inside, to bring more light into this issue. And so a lot of these things that we need to do is to really just bring more attention. And I think that is what Black Lives Matter has done. It has brought to the attention that these kinds of issues are not only going on in certain parts of the country, and it's not only affecting a certain community, it's affecting all of us. So I think the work needs to continue to be done. And it's so important to just continue to share the floor together with both of these organizations, both of these activists, because at the end of the day, it's really both of our powers coming together to make a change. And I think we've been able to see some of the change that we've been able to bring forward in these past couple of months.
Thank you, Sarai. Did you still have a few more minutes, or if not, we can leave that for questions?
Yeah, we can talk a little bit more in terms of just Dreamers, which is the most of the work that I've done for the majority of the time. It's also been really hard in terms of just creating different pathways for college students and high school students to learn how they can continue their education. So one of the things that I did earlier on while I was in college was sort of mentoring different high school students and helping them figure out and navigate what scholarships, what schools they could be applying to. And now, thankfully, there are many organizations who have taken this upon themselves to really provide a list of different scholarships that people can apply to, schools that are now giving full rides or partial scholarships directly to students. But again, this work has all been done by activism and activism of the youth. But in terms of giving more opportunities, again, I think the biggest disconnect now is that now that we have so many Dreamers with their college degrees, it's how can we get them into the doors of jobs, specifically corporate America. So that's really where I'm trying to make the connection in terms of we've gotten them to get the education. How can we open the doors for them to come in and diversify all of these different corporations within the United States, and also just that comes into the conversation of diversity and inclusion as well, in terms of having more diversity, not only within leadership, but just overall within the workplace.
Thank you. Well, for those of you that are listening, I'm sure you might have some questions for Sarai. We're going to save all the questions for the end. So thank you, Sarai. And now we will hear from Christopher Vergara.
Thank you. It's interesting, this work, I got involved in this work, and it's sort of funny, I feel the certain weight of it because my family, most of my parents, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles are immigrants to this country, my partner is an immigrant, my son is an immigrant, and here I am just because of where I was born, I have a lot of privilege. And I realized it listening to Sarai's story, and I'm reminded of that. And that sort of was how I got involved in the work of immigration justice and sanctuary. My congregation, St. Peter's Church in Manhattan, went through a process of declaring sanctuary, but one of our limitations is that we can't necessarily have overnight guests. So what did it mean to be sanctuary that wasn't just a place of long-term shelter? And we learned and explored what that meant, and what that means in our calling as a church. But then also that work continued into our synod, which is sort of the overarching body that sees over the congregations in Metro New York. And when that body declared itself sanctuary, we realized that it was much more than just about long provisions of shelter, but it was a response to the raids and deportations. It was a strategy to advocate for the end of mass detention and a vision of what our communities could be, and a really a moral imperative based on the ancient traditions of the church. And so 3 years ago, our synod, ventured and made that decision, and we lived into that. So then, but then what does that mean? What are we living into? What are we actually doing in that work? And for us, it became clear we were called to, so we created sort of a sanctuary and what we called Amparo ministry. And Amparo is sort of our church body's way of talking about that work. And their focus was on migrant minors. So it was accompanying migrant minors with protection, advocacy, representation, and opportunity. So we looked at how we could do that in our synod. And we were surprised, I was surprised to realize that there were two sort of facilities where minors were being held in the footprint of our territory, of our synod. And so we started a long process of trying to develop some kind of relationship to be able to provide care for the minors in the facility. And it took a long time. The first, we were trying to just do some kind of recreational, some kind of outing for the kids who we had heard inside and all day long, and well, that's not healthy necessarily for kids at all. So with the help of actually one of the consulates and through the city of New York, we were finally able to make some headway and take the kids on a field trip that we organized to Randall's Island with Gotham Knights Rugby Club, which is a rugby club that I play for. And we did sort of a field day for them. And then we did another trip where we took them rock climbing, indoor wall climbing. And what we've been trying to do is provide opportunities to have outings of educational, recreational, cultural, artistic outings on a regular basis to give them sort of access, to have them have some kind of dignity and as children. And one of the things that we realized from the social workers was that many of the kids were asking for to speak with a clergy person. And so we really worked to provide some kind of pastoral care to the kids, or access to that. So many times on our trips, we have a number of pastors who come along. Pastor Newmark has been a partner in many times, and even hosted an event at her church, so that the kids, when they want to, could pray or have some kind of access to a person of faith. And that, I tell you, is probably some of the most moving things that I've seen. On one of our trips, we took a number of kids to the Bronx Zoo, I remember, and there was a girl who was very sort of downtrodden and not just having a sad day. And we're not trying to make them have a good time, because I can't imagine the trauma that they're living through and engaging in. But at lunchtime, she was sort of sitting by herself, and one of our pastors went over to sit and have lunch with her and speak with her. And so she was distraught because her parents had told her to remember this prayer that she had associated to a little medal, saint medal that she was carrying, and she couldn't remember the prayer. And so the pastor with their phone. They started looking, trying to figure out what and they were able to figure it out and pray it together and share that and help her remember it again. And the change was immediate. For the rest of the afternoon, there was life, there was some joy from this young girl. And so that's been sort of the work that we've been trying to do, is to give them access to these spaces and to give them some kind of care, pastoral care while we do that. Now in COVID time, that has been much, much more difficult because of the safety protocols and all of that. And recently we found out that that's one of the centers who housed, hundreds of children, or who processed hundreds of children, is basically empty now. There are about 5 to 6 kids there now because half of them were, reunited with families, or, deported or relocated to other cities that aren't, sanctuary cities. And so that was it's really been sad to think about that. They have been dispersed, but we continue to try to figure out ways which to engage and to care and to provide care for these young people. Apart from the kids who are in detention, we also work and try to get minors out of the detention centers once they turn 18. Once they turn 18, they go to the adult detention center, as many of you know. They're still considered minors between the 18 to 21. So we try to, right when they've gone to become 18, try to work to get them released. And over the years, we've been able to help release a number of young people and accompany them in life outside of detention. And we're currently working to try to get 2 more young people out. One of them, a young man who in the LGBTQIA community who is suffering unprecedented abuse, not only from the guards, but also from fellow detainees. So the work, even during the pandemic, continues to accompany and to work for these young people to live with dignity or some sort of dignity in our country, and to start to heal from the trauma that they've experienced. It's a lot of work, but we continue, and we must continue to do this work. And we're excited to be able to do it as a synod, and it continues to be a priority of our bishop, Paul Eggensteiner, and part of a priority in his vision of the work that we do as a synod in our advocacy task force. So that's, it's great to have partners in that. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to read a really short section from my book that actually relates to, is about a child in one of the centers. In fact, the center that, the one center that our synod has been working with the most. And then we'll have lots of time for any questions. It was a Thursday when I answered a call from a friend in the sanctuary movement that trains and coordinates volunteers to accompany and support immigrants in court and in crisis. Some days the work makes a difference. A member of my church who'd been trained in court accompaniment did what dozens of people do every day at the New York Federal Plaza Immigration Court. She joined with others in the courtroom when an asylum seeker went before the judge. The rules required all visitors to sit in silence, which they did, but their presence voiced their testimony. After lawyers for both sides presented their cases, the judge looked up, took in the silent witness, and turned to the man whose fate was being decided for that day. "I see you have family here," she said, and postponed his deportation order. The call I received that Thursday asked for a person who could be available that very morning and who could speak Spanish. Email requests go out most mornings, but it's rare that I can drop everything else to respond. This time I could. A 7-year-old child, Eduardo, had crossed the border from Mexico into El Paso, Texas, with his grandmother, hoping to reunite with his mother. ICE apprehended the pair and immediately separated them. They locked the grandmother in a Texas facility and put Eduardo on a plane with strangers to a center in East Harlem, where many other children detainees are held. Eduardo arrived at the center in the middle of the night, as is usual, to avoid public attention. When my friend contacted me, Eduardo had already been separated from his family for 3 months and began vomiting up all the food he ate. In recent weeks, Eduardo had ceased eating altogether, became seriously ill, and was hospitalized. His mother was outside the radar of ICE, but the grandmother got permission to visit for 2 weeks in order to convince the little boy to eat. ICE allowed it only because of outreach from the sanctuary movement, who had been trying to track the child down, and because they didn't want to have a child's death on their hands at this point. People in the movement arranged for Eduardo's grandmother and mother to travel to New York. I was told that I would meet with the grandmother at a chosen location, but when I arrived, Eduardo's mother was there too. The desperate women poured out their story, which contradicted much of the public rhetoric on family separations. When his mother tried to speak with Eduardo on the phone and get the address of where he was being held, the social worker refused to help her. Eventually, Eduardo was released from the hospital and allowed to visit with his family at the center for 2 hours a day, but not on weekends because there were not enough staff to supervise. Eduardo was not allowed off the premises of the center, treated like a prisoner rather than a traumatized 7-year-old who cries every day when his family leaves and then again refuses to eat. The room where Eduardo slept was basically a closet with a bunk bed. His mother and grandmother could barely squeeze into the space. They told me that Eduardo had bruises on his head where older boys hit him, although the staff insisted they tried to keep the older and younger children apart. Presently, the center is one of many under investigation for the sexual abuse of the children in its care. According to the Department of Justice, children were to be reunited with their families as soon as the family could be located. But even though Eduardo's family had arrived, he was not allowed to return to them. The government required fingerprints and DNA testing to prove that the mother was not a criminal or stranger trying to traffic him, even though she had his birth certificate from Mexico and he wailed for her, "Mama, mama." She was told it could take a month to get the fingerprint report back. But 1 month passed and then 2, and now nobody knows. The DNA test was allegedly missing. Eduardo stayed in a much better physical environment than the children held in filthy cages. He had an actual bed and meals, but the food he ate was no better than crackers, which is all that the children I met closer to the border received. Because his extreme distress didn't allow him to keep anything down. There's nothing better achieved by seizing a child from a loving family. The only bright spots in this long night of betrayal were the people of faith rallying to help, locating family members, buying tickets for them to travel, and providing hospitality for the mother and grandmother in New York. After I met the grandmother and mother, listened to their story, offered the prayers they requested, and took them to find Mexican food for Eduardo, they asked me to take them to the center where Eduardo was being held captive. Before we could go, a member of a synagogue, also active in the sanctuary network, pulled up in his car, having volunteered and been scheduled to drive them to see Eduardo that day and drive them back. I don't know where Eduardo is now. Many of the children at the East Harlem Center are sent to foster care with no promise that they will ever return to their families. There are stars that shine in this night as this night of betrayal drags on, but no sign of dawn. So we have heard certainly from 2 stars in this long night of betrayal, Christopher and Sarai, and now I open this to any questions you might have for them. Anybody have a question?
I think we have one in the
I have a
chat.
question in the chat, yeah. Do you want to read it, Heidi, or would you like me to?
Why don't you read it?
Okay. Sarai, what do you wish people knew about DACA and Dreamers that they don't seem to know currently?
Yes, I think that's a really great question. And that's a big dilemma that we have within the immigration movement, specifically within DACA. I think overall, the message that we're now trying to pivot to is that we believe that an immigration reform should be the solution, because it shouldn't only have to be for the perfect DACA recipient or dreamers, because that's sort of the spotlight where DACA was first introduced as. You are a noteworthy citizen, you have an education, you are contributing by having a good job. And so that really wouldn't be possible without the sacrifice of our parents and every other 11 million immigrants in this country. And so what we really are trying to pivot the conversation to is how can we get relief for all of these 11 million immigrants, not only for DACA recipients, because there is no perfect immigrant here. I think everyone provides back to this country in different ways, and that is valid. And you don't have to have a specific level of education in order to be considered a good person and worthy of citizenship in this country.
Thanks. And a question for you, Christopher. In what ways do you see the church speaking prophetically to immigrants at this time? And in what ways does the church need to step up?
I think we're lucky to have a lot of examples of churches stepping up at this time. There are a number of churches who are committing themselves to be sanctuary, declaring themselves sanctuary, many who are housing people long-term to do that work. We have the prophetic voice of Pastor Newmark and her church that we can read in the book and see how they are creating a community of equity and justice where those things are centered. And we can take that as an example for all our churches. I think where churches need to step up is to, I think we don't realize, I'm surprised often when talking with people of the church who say, there are no immigrants in my community. We don't, how can we do, what can we do? And having to educate them to open that they're there, it's just this invisible people who are around us providing so many services, making the economy work, especially as we know during this COVID time, being essential workers, delivering our food all over the city, and working in they're there, and we just have to see them, and not only see them, but invite them into our church spaces and tell them that they are welcome and that they are loved, children of God. And if we could just do that, that would be, I think, amazing.
Any other questions from anybody? Well, I have a question, Sarai, about the situation of DACA now, and where it stands with Trump, and what could change with hopefully a new president. What's going on for Dreamers today?
Yeah, so we are in a very tough situation, as we always are, especially during an election year. Immigration, and specifically DACA, has always been something that, both parties always sort of dangle in between in front of us in terms of who's going to get the Latino vote. But for the moment being, DACA is really at risk, specifically not knowing who's going to fill in the seat at the court. Right now, so usually for DACA, you're able to renew your work permit every 2 years. Now it's been shortened to 1 year, and that creates a whole list of different issues. So there has recently been the spotlight brought on to discrimination at work, specifically for DACA recipients, because companies now do not want to invest in employees that are not going to be able to work long-term for a company. So I think now we're going to start seeing the effects of different DACA recipients when they are applying to jobs, not being able to get these jobs, specifically in corporate America, because they are not guaranteed to be working here for longer than a year. So we really are at risk. We still do not know if there's going to be a permanent solution in place, if there's going to be an immigration reform, which that most likely won't be the case anytime soon. But it's more of a reason why we need to continue fighting, especially along with Black Lives Matter, as to having a more permanent solution in place, because it's really a livelihoods. We can't be living on a year to year to figure out if we're going to be able to stay here, we're going to be able to have a job, specifically if we're going to be able to grow our careers. So everything is really still up in the air at this moment.
And I think it's what Sadie has highlighted is really important, is that connection of there's the problems of people being anti-immigrant, and then the problems in this country of being anti-Black, and the particular struggles of Black immigrants is just that much more complicated and difficult for them. The intersection of their immigration status and their Blackness, and this is a problem, as I said, in the Latin community, where we have a lot of Afro Latinos who are having even more difficult time managing the landscape of this country right now, and highlighting and remembering that intersection exists and that we have to confront it is really important.
And another,
I think that's.
Oh, go on.
Sorry. I think that's why the importance of us working together is really pivotal at this moment, right? Because the media has created a sort of immigrant story where it is a Latino who is usually the immigrant. The rhetoric is that it's usually Mexican, and it's never highlighted that the Black immigrant story. And so, as Christopher mentioned, there's even more issues with trying to navigate Blackness versus immigration. And so I think that's what we're trying to aim to, at least on the immigration front, and personally, my mission to bring forth those stories and highlight that, because that is a true narrative that is going on, and that's not highlighted within the mainstream media.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was surprised because I was ignorant when I was at the border at San Diego and Tijuana. There were, in Tijuana, the groups I was visiting, there were lots of immigrants from Cameroon who had flown, I don't remember exactly where they flew to, and then they traveled up, and then they were there in Tijuana to cross the border at San Isidro, which is a major crossing point. And they were from, I was expecting, oh, these are going to be the asylum seekers from Central America and Mexico, but that wasn't, and that was true, and that was the majority of people. But then there were all these people from Cameroon. And another area of intersectionality is with queer people, and we've had people in our shelter who are undocumented. So, and usually and who are there because they're fleeing hate because of their sexual orientation or because they're transgender. And usually the same people that are anti-immigrant are anti-queer. There's intersectionality of hate. So there needs to be the other intersectionality of seeking justice together. Absolutely.
And I would say even further, there's the intersectionality of hate within our own community, specifically Latinos. When we're also talking about Black immigrants, we're also talking about our Afro, Latinos, Latinx immigrants. And so that's the really hard conversation that we need to have, and sort of what I'm trying to build this toolkit around. How can you have these conversations at your dinner table with your parents and your relatives? Because we know that we are unfortunately brought up with this idea of white is great, and there are so many different things that we have within our language. For example, the phrase of, lightening, your generation, right? That's something that a lot of Latinos say, and that is very racist. And so it's something that's deeply seated within the Latinx community that we need to begin to dismantle in order to move forward and realize that these people are part of our community, and we have a lot of internal work to do in order to be better as well.
And did you say you're creating a toolkit for people to use?
Yes, in terms of how recognizing what are those, phrases that are racist or colorism, and how can you sort of shift that conversation and start questioning why are we using these kinds of phrases? Because it's hard to have those conversations specifically with family members, and I think that's where the real work has to be done.
And you courageously do that.
Thank you.
Are there any last minute questions that anybody has? Well, I'm sure you join me in being very grateful for both Sarai and Christopher and their work and their voices and their witness. And I can't thank them enough. And I'm supposed to mention if you would like to buy my book. It's always the hard part. But if you'd like to buy my book, but I'm really excited to encourage you to go to bookshop.com for any book, because someone has my book. Because bookshop.com, as I mentioned at the beginning, a proportion of any money you spend there goes to support independent bookstores. So you're both, it's a great place to support. Thank you. If you'd like to share this conversation with others, it's going to be up on Trinity Lutheran Church of Manhattan YouTube channel, and we're also going to put it on Facebook for people that can access that more readily. Thank you for spending some of your night with us, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening. Thanks again, Sarai and Christopher.